So going back to why we're here today, what is cognitive diversity? I was talking a lot about identity diversity earlier, things that are observable, things that are more demographic, perhaps, but there's functional ways that people are different, their experiences and backgrounds. And I know a lot of you know a lot about this topic. So I just wanted to kind of lay out that, in case you didn't know, that like having cognitive diversity in the workplace carries with it sometimes a double-edged sword. Sometimes there's a lot more conflict. There's less cohesion because you have that, butting heads, and you have the different personality types and temperaments. But usually the product has been shown to be more innovative and more exciting, more forward, but it might have taken longer. And it might have had a lot more friction. When I polled the same people at that identity survey, I wanted to talk about the importance that you place on the skill of being able to discuss social issues with people you disagree with. And people have different levels of being comfortable with arguing or debating about, healthy debate, being constructive when you're disagreeing with somebody. And so you want to kind of notice in the room that there are different levels of being open to diverse opinions. So one of my last slides is about openness to kind of diversity. So it's not about companies only looking at the numbers, the check boxes of getting your employees to be diverse in an identity sort of way, demographic sort of way. There's also functional diversity, so that you have people, different backgrounds, different resources, different information sets, skill sets. There's that, but there's also that openness to cognitive diversity. How open are you to actually, try something new, experiment, and listen to the opposing view? One of the things that you could do, just very basically, I'm sure a lot of you do this in your own workplaces, is to set up every new project with a parameter of safe space, like what is allowed during these meetings, these team meetings, and what is not allowed, what is safe and not safe to bring up, to make everybody feel respected, and it's a mutually agreed upon kind of contract in a way. And sometimes you might think that people have been working for many, many years together might have these implicit assumptions about what these rules might be, but sometimes it's nice to revisit them. Also, that social conflict can pay off. Think about some of the payoffs of the intellectual contributions that are happening. Even though you feel like you're at a standstill, there's a lot of potential that could happen. What counts as progress on a team? Is it all about the timeline? Is it all about the efficiency? Is it all about the bottom line? Or can we open up the definitions of what counts as progress? Are we uncomfortable yet in a way that could be thought of as progress, not just in a room with a bunch of yes people who just want to push it forward and clock out? Do we figure out where the wall is hit, where we need to bring in more experts to help us understand this problem in a different way? That's really important to kind of acknowledge what you don't know. And the pressure to perform, basically timelines need to be thought of as ways in which people have different comfort levels cognitively. Some people really want things to be very neat and tidy and just, done in the most efficient way. And other people are okay with being in the mess, being in the kind of fuzziness. And so it'd be interesting for project members to kind of check in with each other about timelines and if it should be, kind of adjusted according to the progress at this moment. It kind of reminds me of the whole COVID-19. It's the virus that's going to set the timeline. It's not about what you want to get done to open up all the businesses. You want it to get done as quickly and efficiently as possible for the bottom line, America to kind of, start up again. But it's about something outside of ourselves sometimes. And just to give you an example of how we've done on our research team, one quick example about how we've tried to invite different people from different backgrounds to invite themselves to join projects, and a very quick and easy implicit way to encourage people to be interested in a project, we sent out kind of invitations that had different titles about what the project was about. But actually the project was the same for everybody, but we just label it differently. And so we wanted to know who would come to these projects, who would be interested in joining our teams based on the titles. And we found that if you talked about general identity, you're attracting people with higher education, people like a lot of Caucasian participants. If you ask, if you're talking about race, culture, and gender, you're going to, by nature, just invite more female, more people of color, people with lower socioeconomic status. LGBT people would be more interested in joining that team. People who are interested in political and social issues, it attracts a lot more males if you want more male perspectives, more heterosexual perspectives. Those are the kind of titles that you would kind of bring out in people so that you can help them decide what they'd be interested in, and they can bring an asset onto your team. So that was just a quick little thing that we did that didn't cost any money, didn't cost much more time, and you got to learn more information about what people want to bring to these projects. And that's it. Check out my webpage, and I can't wait to hear about everybody else's perspectives on cognitive diversity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charmaraman, and let's give her a digital hand. All right, perfect. Thank you so much. And so don't worry, we're going to dig deeply into the research and into the neuroscience when we speak in our panel discussion in just a moment. I've got some follow-up questions for you, but I know that our audience does too. So if you are participating in our Slack group, go ahead and write those questions in, and we're going to have those presented during the Q&A period shortly. All right, so our next speaker again is Sade Mohammed, the Director of Representation and Inclusion at Forbes. So Sade, feel free to take it away.
Awesome, thank you guys. Can you all hear me all right?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I want to share my screen with you guys. So let me know if you can see my screen.
We can.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm really happy to be here with you all. As Will mentioned, I am in a new role at Forbes, Director of Representation and Inclusion Partnerships. And what that means is that we really help brands and want to help brands create meaningful and engaging conversations with our audience. And the purpose is really to reimagine capitalism inclusively. So how do we do that thoughtfully? How do we do that more authentically? How do we include everyone in the conversation and drive business forward at the same time? So what I wanted to do was give you guys an example of how we've done that at Forbes. And so I'm going to do that through a partnership that we had with Cole Haan, the shoe company. And so when I look back over the partnership, which is 2+ years at this point, there are kind of 3 key principles that drove success. And the first is challenging our own assumptions, our own individual assumptions. The second was this idea of no experts. And the third was having trust, real trust at each level of the chain. So to give you a little bit of a background on the partnership. So this was called the Changemaker series, this partnership with Cole Haan. And what it really was creating a space to highlight entrepreneurs, their passions, or up and coming folks who are using their careers to make the world a better place. So when you think about shoes, and the first thing you think about might not be entrepreneurs and making the world a better place, but again, that's part of the the marketing strategy. And kudos to our client Cole Haan, our agency team, for saying beyond driving clicks to buy, more tactically, we want to take the longer view and really drive consideration among our key audience, which in this case were about 25 to 34-year-olds living in coastal cities. So the first principle, as I said, was we challenged our own assumptions. So each stakeholder took personal responsibility in challenging what they thought they knew and what they believed to be true. And so with that, that really came into play with our audience development. So again, like I said, we were focusing on this kind of core 25 to 34 audience, coastal cities. A lot of people in the room could relate to this segment. They might have fallen into it, myself included. And so the idea was, okay, you know, obviously we think we know what this consumer wants and needs, but let's each challenge our idea of what we think that is to really find some new connections and push things forward. So here you'll see a few ideas, a few outputs. So these are 3 stories in the social impact segment of the feature. So we kind of broke it down for the entrepreneurs into social impact, travel, wellness, and fashion. And so you'll see we did the story on a founder, Ashley Edwards, behind the nonprofit that coaches at-risk students to heal from trauma. So we wanted to look beyond kind of what are the standard, you know, in the dorm room to, you know, billion-dollar company stories of founders, and really dig deep into folks who may not be superstars at the moment, but will really tap into kind of the psyche of this audience who, you know, is trying to make it, wants to build, and is doing that through authentic empowerment of their community. So we looked at kind of really diverse folks, and folks who we didn't look at the first list or even the second list or the third list of the people that we came up with. We kept challenging, why are we using this person? Why not this person? And, you know, kept challenging our assumptions of what our audience wanted to see. The second principle really was around, like I said, no experts. So, you know, there were a lot of experts in the room. So we had, you know, content experts, we had, you know, Facebook ad experts, we had, you know, advertising experts overall. So there were a lot of experts in the room in their particular functions, but we didn't herald anyone as an expert in solving this shared problem. And that can be really hard to do, especially in a client and in a consultant sort of relationship with the client and and someone who we're advising. So in this case, we were the advisor. So that's, you know, typically when you come into that sort of relationship, there's automatically this kind of assumption that, you know, hi consultant, you know, you should know, understand, we'll tell you what we want, and then you should come up with that, and it should work. And those weren't the table stakes here. The table stakes were, you know, hey, this is what we're thinking about. What do you think? You know, let's test that theory. Does that make sense? Here's why it does or doesn't. Here's what I can individually bring to the table. Here's what you can. Let's continue to test and learn. And it wasn't this kind of undue emphasis on any one person or any particular team to deliver. It was on everyone to say, how do we solve this problem? So these are just a couple more examples. We did a video shoot with a spearfisher woman who was a lawyer and turned into a spearfisher woman. So she had a really interesting story when we looked at travel. So again, not some of the more traditional stories, but really digging deep and saying who's doing things differently here. It's okay if they're unknown. It's okay if they're, you know, in Ohio or off, you know, maybe not falling into our audience segment, but who's telling an interesting story. And then the last part was we believe that what each team member was saying was true. So this might seem a little obvious, but you know, it's kind of, it's not always the case. So in this instance, even if someone had a gut feeling or reaction or instinctual reaction to, you know, a marketing strategy, a particular entrepreneur, et cetera, we took that at face value. We didn't just react to that and say, look, we have a deadline. You know, sometimes we wanted to say that, of course, but every single person, if they rose their hand and said, you know, this is something that I feel strongly about, I feel like we should go in another direction or take another look at this, we took that extremely seriously. So to Linda's point, it did slow down the timeline a bit, but in the end, it really led to something that everyone felt that they could really stand behind unequivocally, and it built a stronger product overall. And that was, you know, from the most junior level on the team to the most senior. And then a couple more examples here in the middle, you'll see we did a story on Jessamine, who's a yoga instructor who redefines whole body positivity. So again, kind of challenging the norms of what a yoga instructor is and looks like. And in the end, the results in this campaign is ongoing, as I mentioned, but it delivered some of the highest time spent on article content, video content across our brand partners, which we have over 100, the highest organic social activity. A lot of the posts took off in their mini communities as we lifted up entrepreneurs who usually don't get the shine. And kind of for the bottom line, the back-to-back program renewals, which we always like to see. So I just thought Gohan was a great example of how we worked with an agent, managed agency relationship, a client relationship to come together and not, come at it with the same expectations of, this person is an expert and this person can only speak about this topic, really saying, what do you think? What do you feel? And valuing each person's contribution at every step.
Thank you so much, Sade. Now let's get a digital hand for her.
Thanks, guys.
And so, what I think is really interesting about that is that not only did, we create a way to highlight examples of individuals who are breaking the mold and who are moving beyond the boxes that people put them in, which is really important to seeding the broader discussion and changing minds. We also lived that practice as we created that particular approach. So thank you so much for sharing that story. All right, for our final speaker presentation, I'm going to toss it off to the one, the only, Pranav Yadav. Take it away, Pranav.
Thank you. I think it'll be hard to live up to everything that's been said so far and that wonderful introduction. As I was listening to the other speakers, I was like, damn, I should have looked at those Slack groups because it looks like I didn't get the memo. But that's actually the precise point. Because what I'm going to say is so different from the other two speakers is exactly the point why we actually need cognitive diversity. Because you have two phenomenal experts and then you have a random ass philosopher who's going to start with a story. So I'm going to share my screen, but I'm going to keep it there for a second just so I can tell you a story. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
All right. So here's a story that I heard recently. Buddha was going for a morning walk and he had his friend Anand with him. He sees this first guy, is like, Buddha, I have a question. Is there God? And Buddha replies, yes, there is God. Moves on in the afternoon, he sees another guy asks him the same question, Buddha, is there God? And he says, no, there is no God. Goes walking around in the evening, sees another guy, says, Buddha, is there God? Buddha looks at him, stares for a second or two, smiles, and just walks on. And meanwhile, his friend Anand, who is there with him the entire time, is confused as hell. So goes to him and is like, say, hey, Buddha, now I'm confused. I don't know if there's God or no God. Can you answer my question? And Buddha says, well, don't for a second believe that any one of those answers was meant for you. Those answers were specifically meant for the seeker. The first person I met was someone who was a non-believer, who was an atheist. He's never considered the possibility of seeing God or there being God. So to make sure that his mind is as expansive as it can be, I told him that there is God so he can go out and look for God. The second person I met was a believer, but was a believer because his parents asked him to believe and his society asked him to believe. So he'd never questioned the existence of God. So I told him that there is no God because I wanted to expand his worldview. And the last person I saw had been seeking God for a long time, to which I looked at him and smiled because he was on the right path, without answering the question or denying the existence of God. So why does this happen? Why is it that different people perceive the world differently? Why is it that we actually need different answers to the same question to actually ultimately get to the same conclusion? That to me is this topic. Why does the cognitive diversity exist? And how do we actually work with it to do what we do? So the way I'm going to break down my 5 minutes is looking at the topic and looking at what it is, why is it good, why is it hard, and then lastly, why we must strive for it. What does it bring to the table that we should not ignore? So like the way my brain works, which is different from a lot of yours, is starting off with looking at like, what is it that I'm actually trying to answer? So I took the problem statement, cognitive diversity, the neuroscience behind high performing teams, and it started with the word cognitive. What is cognition? Do we have a clear definition for it? We actually do. Cognition is a term referring to the mental processes involved in gaining knowledge and comprehension. These processes include thinking, knowing, remembering, judging, and problem solving. Now, within this world of cognition, from the worlds of philosophy entering into neuroscience, you have two major families of philosophers, right? You have the Platos and the Aristotle, which was later followed by Descartes and Chomsky, people who believe that the way we think is that we bring forth what is within us, but what is within us exists from the very beginning. And that is called the rationalism part. The second part starts with Aristotle, and then you can actually see Locke and Skinner talking about that we gain knowledge by observing the world around us. And then we use that knowledge in conscious and subconscious ways to actually come to our conclusions as to how we do things. And that's called empiricism. In the world of neuroscience, there is actually no room for the first part, because we rely on the idea that everything that we do, we have learned through our experiences in our life on this planet, right? We all understand what the word diversity means, but just to be frivolous about it, I put the definition out there. Mm-hmm. Now, how does the combination of these two words work together? Cognitive diversity. Difference in the way we think, difference in the way we solve problems. From the context of neuroscience, your brain is essentially your CPU. If you were a computer and if we all were robots, the brain is essentially the processor that you have. Culture, society, your experiences that you have in life essentially is your operating system. What does an operating system do for a computer? It tells you when you see a certain set of commands, how do you actually respond? So if someone puts their hand out to shake your hand, you put your hand out unless it's the time of COVID-19. In that case, you just turn around and walk away. But that is all coded within, that was a joke, you can smile. That is all within us in our operating systems, because essentially what it is a set of rules written down on how to deal with a certain set of commands that will come out. Now, what happens to an English person or an American person who's used to hugging or kissing once, who ends up in France, where people kiss twice? You actually see a mishmash of these operating systems, and the files show up a little scrambled like an Apple file on a Mac, on a Windows computer. So what am I trying to bring forth with all of this is that all of us, through the cultures that we grew up in, the experiences that we have had in our lives, essentially have created for ourselves, using the basic CPU, the brain that we have, a worldview, a framework to solve problems, much like I have used mine to actually even bring forth this point. Just to show you how that works out in market for some of the biggest brands in the world, I'm going to show you an example. Now, my company essentially maps people's brains on an ongoing basis, looking at how they respond to any kind of marketing or advertising stimulus, okay? And understanding what the deepest drivers of human motivation are allows us to tell the brands, this is the product you need to work on, and this is how you actually communicate it. And within your communication, this is how you optimize it. So we took the same ad, which was for an iPhone, that we showed to a group of Samsung consumers and a group of Apple consumers. And what you're about to see is the second by second brain activity to the same ad from these two different groups. Now, intuitively, we know that these two groups respond differently. We don't know how differently. Also, if you randomly ask a person walking on the street, are the brains of these two people different? Everybody will answer, not really. So how is it that we actually see such a difference purely based on the cognitive abilities of the person? That is what I'm about to display. So here, I'm going to play the second by second brain response.
This is the new iPhone 6. And this is the new iPhone 6 Plus. They're the biggest iPhones ever made. They are huge. But their size is just the beginning. Even though they're huge, they could change the way you see the world. That's big. They can help you improve your health. That's massive. They're more powerful than ever before. That's gargantuan. No one says gargantuan. Lots of people I know say gargantuan. What are their names? Susie?
Did the sound come through okay?
Yes, it did.
Oh, fantastic. I love technology. So as you start off with the ad, when you see the Apple users, they engage with the commercial knowing that is actually the product that they use, and they already are committing all of this information into memories. Whereas the Samsung consumers come in, they look at the iPhone on the screen and they begin to disengage. And all of the showing off that happens by Apple that is going to be bigger, etc., the Android users like, well, I've had a phone twice the size for a long time, so I don't really care about this. Till the time you actually get to this, that this actually takes care of your health and it's more powerful than ever before, that is the time that the Samsung consumers loop in. It's like, hey, wait a minute, that's information that I need to have so that I can make my decisions tomorrow in a more informed manner. And then they get into the silly jokes, which only the Apple consumers enjoy, and then we end the ad. So this is an example of how two groups of people, and so this is 50 people who were Samsung consumers and 50 people who were Apple consumers reacting to it differently. So the first point I wanted to prove was that we are different and what cognitive diversity is. So why is it good? Creativity, which is the success factor for any high-performing team, is nothing but your brain's ability to connect different, discrete, seemingly disparate data sets within your brain. And when you happen to connect them, you have the eureka moment, and therefore the creative process has begun. When you're actually interacting with other people and when you're in a team, what can happen is that it can expedite this creative process, because another person can mention something that leapfrogs like the reliability of the circuit system that you have within your creative process and get you to step 4 from step 1 like that. When that happens, you then connect more dots and jump from step 4 to step 8 like that. And while that happens, another person goes, well, actually that struck a whole different creative process in my head. So let me actually feed that into my loop, and begins the fantastic, the ideal case scenario of great teamwork, where each person brings a way of thinking that is distinct to themselves, but in interaction with someone else's actually sees a lift in each person's creative process. So that's the best case scenario, and that's why it is good. Why is it hard? Because if the cognitive diversity is not connected by a central person. So when you take a super technical person who thinks a certain way about technology and life and bring him with a certain kind of salesperson whose entire worldview is telling stories, there's an absolute disconnect, and it's very hard for one person to spark creativity in the other person. Bring in a general person like Will, who has had a variety of experiences, starting from technology to telling stories, to be able to bridge that gap, and suddenly that team starts performing well. But the idea that you actually need to pick that cognitive diversity in a way that is actually productive and rather than counterproductive is the biggest challenge that we face, and it's very hard to solve for. And you know, different companies do it different ways. They have personality tests, they have other kind of cognitive tests that they make people do, but no one's really even able to actually crack how to build the perfect team. But the idea that you actually need that diversity is something that we all agree on and understand. So why must we truly strive for it? And for that, will actually go back to philosophy. If you look at the root of all spirituality and the biggest, philosophical practices in the world, the ultimate way of being is the thought process that allows for every way of being. That's when you become one with the universe. That's when you have truly identified, acknowledged, respected that all of these distinct ways of thinking exist. And I have now all of that within myself as a living organism. In the Vedanta philosophy, it's called the Param Atma, the ultimate being. And that is a process that keeps showing up in philosophy and in spirituality, and more in our workplaces as well. So that's where I'll stop. We have traveled the world from neuroscience and philosophy, and we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Pranav. Really appreciate it. Okay, so I've got a couple questions before we ask some questions from our audience who have been diligently providing their feedback over Slack. So first of all, we talked about conflict as being a double-edged sword. And a lot of that conflict comes from these clashing, interlocking identities and tribalism, right? And one of the things that, at least I've heard is that when someone of a different identity as you're put into a situation of pressure with them, you kind of withdraw into your own spheres, and you're less concerned about their well-being than you are about somebody who is perceived as being part of your own tribe. To what extent does the kind of pressure that we're under every day as a high-performing team actually work against our ability to create cognitive diversity, and what can we do about that? And maybe I'll toss it to Linda first.
It is that universal question of, how can we come together when we're so different, and yet, are we so different? There's universal aspects of us in our experiences as human beings, as philosophers, as people, who have had tremendous experiences throughout the life. And there are things in which, if we remember in those pressure-filled moments to come together and remember that we're all here as, like, one of your identities could be, we are on team A, and team A needs to come together to fulfill this task in a way that is respectful and mutually beneficial for all of our well-being. And to just kind of remind us what the task is, as opposed to feeling like something is jeopardized by somebody calling out a disagreement. Sometimes disagreements are just intellectual disagreements. They're not about saying your tribe isn't as smart as my tribe. That comment, I don't understand where it comes from. Maybe you should ask them, help me understand that comment. Help me understand where you're coming from. Because sometimes even just the communication about a potential misunderstanding could help with empathy. I know you mentioned empathy as being a really important aspect of the workplace environment at some point, and maybe in our earlier conversation. And I think one of the key aspects is frequent communication on teams that have a lot of cognitive diversity, because it's so easy and quick for somebody to make a comment that lingers in somebody's mind, and you suddenly have this perception of that person as very stagnant, or that person is very defensive. Maybe helping to open up that dialogue and just to kind of see, is this, okay, I thought I'm hearing this, did I understand it correctly? And maybe you can help me understand why you think that's a better idea or more efficient, or, and so kind of being open to asking questions as opposed to making conclusions that that person is closed and I guess our conversation is over, but keep opening that box. I guess that would be my suggestion.
Right. No, absolutely. So Pranav, any thoughts on that? And also we've got a question from Rachel Baker. So do you have any recommendations as to how to gauge the right amount of conflict? How do you think about the neuroscience of that?
I'll start with the previous question and then we'll get to this. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Okay, so as humans developed and came, developed cognition and consciousness in the way that we have, a fundamental aspect of it was identity. I've seen it in some of other people's work that they've recognized, a lot of that as well. well, what is identity? You know, it is a fundamental few guiding posts that help us figure out who we are, and we construct a narrative around it. The truth is that it is nothing but a construct. When we were hunter-gatherers, it was on people on that side of the river versus on this side of the river. Then society graduated a little bit. It was people on that side of the mountain versus this side of the mountain. It was the people who speak that language versus this language. That's actually how my country of my origin gets the name. Because as Arabs came to India, there was a river called Sindh. And people on the other side of the river actually were people they started calling Sindhus, which somehow became Hindus. And that's how they named the religion and then the entire country altogether. So how do you actually then race became important. Religion became another identity. And then finally, in the most recent version of it that's been able to collect and identify a bigger group of people is the idea of nation states. We basically tell people that these are the things that we stand for collectively as a group, and the other group is different from us, right? And somehow that unites this group, but obviously creates a divide with another group. Now, what's magical about this is that if you actually study every time this has been done, you realize that it can be done across genders. It can be done across races. Religion has proven that. It can be actually done across languages. In a country like India, where there are 25 languages and 5,000 dialects, and in fact, racial diversity that you see in the entire continent of Europe, you've combined this group of people, have given them an identity. You are Indians, and that's how we will operate, right? So the magic in the workplace to be able to overcome this is to actually start with the education, that how different we may feel from another individual is not because we're fundamentally different robots. It's because our operating systems have been programmed by different people. Now, if we have that knowledge, much like the West world, we will still operate within the constructs of this. But when we have that knowledge, that collectively allows us to run for that door that leads to liberation, where we can disconnect ourselves from our previous idea of identities and create the identities for the organization, for the values that we want to stand for, to come together and work towards them for that cause. So that's my take on that situation. Does that answer your question?
Perfect, perfect. And so, Sade, speaking about education, how is it that we make a business case to senior management that we need to do things differently, that we need to institute workshops, that we need to find ways to bridge the gap between individuals who might not see eye to eye? This is a question from Sean Mader. I hope I didn't mispronounce your last name. What are your thoughts, Sade?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it starts with realizing that there are power dynamics at play whenever you have in any organization. There senior leadership, more junior leadership. So I think recognizing that first and addressing that is the first thing. And it's there. It's there for specific reasons. We don't want to reject it, but recognizing that there may be reasons why we haven't heard from junior leadership, or why senior leadership doesn't know how to broach particular topics with more junior members. So I think identifying examples of where that's happened and how that's affected the business is always a good place to start. So for instance, why a senior leader wasn't aware of a breakdown in the way a product was functioning, or a client agency relationship, or for a junior member to talk about how, because they were unaware of rollouts at the senior level, they, made a mistake in their strategy. So just, I think first identifying where those problems came up, and because it was sort of either lack of communication or lack of understanding, and pointing perhaps to those silos or to that sort of like that expertise, that point that we were bringing up earlier, and saying, how do we break this down? Because here's where it's created holes in our organization.
No, thank you. And so there have been so many good questions to come through over Slack. We unfortunately can't get to all of them, but there's been a couple of common themes that have come out. One of them is, what is the connection between demographic diversity and cognitive diversity? Are they different? Are they the same? Do they feed into each other? And importantly, you know, one of the, Manuel asked, you know, is there a framework that categorizes the different types of groups of cognitive diversity? And so maybe, you know, I would love to get Pranav's take on that. And I'd love to get all of your takes on that. Let's each of you give a second to chat about that as we wrap up the Q&A period. Maybe starting with Pranav.
The truth is that there's an unlimited, you know, number of varieties. But to me, this funny thing is the answer still comes from traditional philosophy, where they have mapped every single storyline in the world in 16 or 32 different kind of storylines, where and every single thought process into 16 or 32 different kinds of thought processes. Because obviously the more granular you go, you will find the difference. But I think the way I think of it is that I pick categories that are important to me. So innovation, risk, and the ability to have empathy. So these are the categories that I pick. And within these categories, the employees in my company is how we actually value and rate them, right? You want the risk-averse person, because, you know, when the person who takes the risk wants to just go for it every time, you want this person to pull them back, and vice versa. Empathy, again, all of these things are correlated as well. You want everybody to have the empathy, but at the same time, too much empathy can actually also at times hold you back, because you will never get anything done, because you will keep thinking every step that I take will actually impact something. That again comes from philosophy, the idea of karma. Nothing is good or bad, but every action will have a consequence. So again, you want people on either end of the spectrum. You just actually have to identify for yourself what those pillars are that I actually need to solve for.
Thank you. Linda, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that functional diversity, like the ones that are not about the identity and demographic, you can have quite a bit of range of people who have underlying, you know, similarities and differences in terms of background experiences. But if you get them all in a room, you may not have identity diversity. You might not have demographic diversity. But if you get a bunch of people in a room that have demographic diversity, identity diversity, by nature, that already usually includes all the other kinds of functional diversity. You're more likely to have people with functional diversity if you have identity diversity already. And sometimes it's easier to assess on an intake form what these people's identities are, you know, their educational backgrounds, how much schooling they've had, compared to those personality tests that are on the market, although they're very interesting. And some of my favorite retreats have been having to take these personality tests to understand our team members. So many different ways of cutting it, though.
And to wrap it up, Sade, I'd love your take on this.
Sure. So Linda, that's a really great point that you bring up. Great insight about if you have identity diversity, you're more likely to have cognitive diversity. I would say, you know, identity diversity is kind of the easier thing to achieve. Although a lot of organizations struggle with it, you know, visible diversity is of course easier to say, you know, that person's of a particular race, gender, orientation, or what have you. Some things you can see, some things you can't. But I think the cognitive diversity is tougher. It means you really have to get to know someone. You have to really have a conversation and figure out what their motivations are, to Pranav's point, you know, and what they really care about. So I think the cognitive diversity means that you have to have deeper conversations. And anytime you have a deeper conversation, you're more likely to get closer to what's really there anyway. So I think striving for the cognitive diversity is probably the harder task, but will pay off more.
And with that, could I get another digital hand for all of our panelists? Thank you for a wonderful discussion. And yeah, that's one of the cruxes of the issue that we're exploring here, that invisible diversity. How can you measure what you don't see? How can you drive things forward when it's so hard to wrap your head or your hands around? So thank you all, and thank you everybody on Slack for your great comments. I'm going to toss it back to Nicole, who will continue the process from here.
Hi, thanks, Will. And again, thank you so much to each and every one of our speakers. And just so everybody knows, our speakers were not only involved with just imparting their valuable insights and knowledge, they were also very hard at work in participating in a previous introductory meeting / ideation session that we started before this session. And for those unfamiliar with what we've been doing over the past week or so, not only have we been on-ramping gearing up for this virtual session, but we actually broke out into different groups. And you've all had a chance to meet each other on Slack, and you had a chance to ask your questions and meet your facilitators as well. But also our speakers are going to join in on an ideation session that's going to start in just a few minutes. But before we do that, I wanted to show you a little taste of what we actually worked on, and also dig into the personas that we're designing for. And so I'm going to share my screen very quickly. One second. Actually, I'm going to speak about the personas fairly quickly. So we decided that we were going to move forward with designing for what we call the disempowered CHRO. And so this person likes to learn about other people, that they're always looking for opportunities to empower their employees, and they know all the members of management, they know the employees very well, so on and so forth. They focus a lot on the misbehaviors of things, and they actually focus a lot on the energy of peer reviews. And before I move on, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay. Let me just shimmy over here. Okay, and so the other persona that we're moving forward with is the hesitant contributor. My apologies to the people who cannot see this clearly. My technology is only so capable, so I'll try to zoom in closer to see if that helps. Okay, and so our second persona here that we're designing for is the hesitant contributor. And so this person, he or she likes to work by herself. They constantly have to prove their value. Unfortunately, they feel deep regret for not speaking up when they should. How many of us have actually felt this way? I know I certainly have. They are not sure how to share their ideas effectively, and they don't really know how to politic. They don't know how to play politics fairly well. And so unfortunately, this is part of the experience that they have day in and day out. And so we're gonna do a quick poll. And so if you go back to your Slack channels, we're gonna do a poll specifically for which one of these personas resonates with you the most. We'll give you about 2 minutes to wrap your head around and digest some of the information that we provided. But if you go back to the Slack channel, you'll be able to cast your vote there, and we'll pick it up where we left off. Actually, while we vote, I know that's going to take a few minutes or so, I wanted to also give some background information to those who joined late. So Forbes Ignite is the consulting practice of Forbes Media. I wanted to be able to mention that. But more specifically, what we're doing today is showcasing what we're doing for our Forbes Knowledge Network. And so what we do, this is just a small taste of what we do in the Knowledge Network. And so the ideation session that we're all doing, I know there's several groups ready to break out into our ideation session. We're actually going to live stream our own session here with our speakers, so you can see what we actually do, helping other businesses, other Global 2000 companies that are trying to reimagine their business models driven by purpose and driven by trying to reimagine what success means and redefining what capitalism is moving into. And so without further ado, we're gonna check out the Slack channel and see the results on the poll. Can everyone see my screen? Awesome. So we're gonna view all the responses here. Wow, it's changing pretty frequently.
And just to give you some context on what we're talking about here, so this ideation session is designed to create real solutions. And so when you're designing for something, you can't design for everyone or you design for nobody. So we had a whole bunch of different options that we chose these two from, and we're asking you, which do you find most interesting?
And so these two personas are actually who our speakers and our group voted on to move forward with. And so our group did a tremendous amount of work ideating around how to address the pain points that each of these personas experience. And so that's how we're going to move forward. And so actually how the speakers were able to do this, I know that it's a lot of information, but really boiling it down to the personas, you want to remember that we're always designing with people first, right? This is a very human-centered way of designing a business model and also how you design a product or a solution. But we're not talking about products right now. We're talking about coming up with real solutions that you can take to your organization tomorrow. This is something that's not just going to be a Band-Aid onto something that we could fix and maybe someone else will take care of it. It's something that's supposed to build toward a longer term solution. And so that's what we're dedicated to today. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And we're going to dive into the result of what our speakers ideated around. And so I'm going to share, hopefully you'll be able to see my screen better. All right, so here we have our how might we questions. And Will, did you want to take it away and dive into the how might we questions?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, before we begin this exercise, we start with a single how might we question, which is provisional. In this case, it was how might we define and replicate the success criteria of high-performing teams to drive the overall strategic purpose of the organization. And so what we had our speakers do was to rapidly ideate, to drop down sticky notes in an ideation grid about ways they would solve particular pain points for the personas that we designed. Then overnight, we correlated these ideas into affinity clusters that would actually help us better understand what are the commonalities between these ideas and what is it that we can learn. So let me give you a quick example. I'm going to zoom in on the affinity cluster to the left because it's the simplest to understand. So you'll see that there are a few ideas here, like cultivating rising talent who have the best chance of making exponential progress in a short time horizon. Get more involved with individual growth resources and personal paths. And I won't read the other ones off to you, but when you boil them down, a question that we might ask to try to solve all of these things is, how might we more easily create thoughtful, flexible, and personalized growth journeys that fulfill individual employees within a team environment? How do you fulfill individuals through customized, or thoughtful, flexible journeys, but within the context of a team? Now you'll notice that there's a lot of other red stickies around here, and each of these clusters has a how might we. But some of them we were able to combine together into a broader how might we question. So let's look at the one up at the top. And when you boil down the 3 red how might we questions for each of these clusters, what it kind of boiled down to was, how might we continuously and easily collect information about the quality of organizational culture, team performance, and individual mindsets in a way that can inform decision-making for leaders and to connect to financial metrics. And so what this is about is it's just it's very hard to measure collaboration, to understand what constitutes good team performance or the right kind of mindsets. And it's especially hard to do that in a way that you can measure it, without having to have some whole separate process. And by the way, have that connect to financial metrics that aren't necessarily the most meaningful to these things, but are what our senior leadership unfortunately cares most about. And so let's go to the final meta how might we question at the bottom right. How might we create a scalable system for employees and organizational leaders to develop relationships with each other, relationships that build empathy, mutual support, and understanding. And this was born of concerns about, it's hard for individuals to persuade leaders of their point of view. They need to build knowledge, and they have a hard time navigating politics. And there's not enough empathy between different ranks of the organization, different teams, and different silos. And so how can we create some way that we're able to do that, outside of one-off offsites that really the benefits disappear very, very quickly. So that's the process by which we got to these. And what we're going to do now is we're going to think about which of these how might we questions do we want to design for? Do we want to create a solution that will actually fix the problem? And Nicole, I'll toss it over to you to take it from here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for going over those. And it might have helped by explaining exactly what a how might we question is. So sorry about that. Overall, very broadly speaking, a how might we question is also known as a challenge question. So how are we approaching these challenges? And so how might we question is just a way to frame your problem solving, to launch ideation and open up the possibilities to explore. And so that's the particular reason why we actually begin all these sentences with how might we. It's really bringing you outside of your comfort zone or what you're normally used to, and just really diving into alternative areas to explore rather than what you see day to day. And so before we move on, so our facilitators are actually hosting their individual ideation sessions separately. And so if you are continuing from yesterday's introductory ideation meeting, your facilitators will be waiting for you in your separate Zoom links, which are found in Slack in each of your individual channels. So we'll give you all about a minute or two to sign in, and we will continue from there. And while we're waiting to get started, I think it's worth it to give a little bit of background. And so in our group's introductory meeting, we each came up with a role for everyone to more or less own, like a timekeeper or a delegator, a decider, a judge, a visualizer, note taker, you name it. And so this is a snapshot of what we came up with. We also decided that we were going to refer to each other by our nicknames from then on and going forward. And so I don't know if I'm not making this a requirement, but I'm going to change my name. If you remember how to do it, it's the top right-hand corner. I'm renaming myself, and as you can see here, my nickname is Tiger from Tiger Mom. So I won't go into that. Yeah, and so we'll be moving forward and we'll be addressing each other by our nicknames. Yeah, and so we did our introductions here. Everyone has their role. So Linda, you are our data person. Sade, you're a timekeeper. Roberto, you're a visualizer. Drew, you're our decider. And Will, you're our note taker. And I just realized that I just broke my rule within the first minute. I just called you by your first names. I'm sorry.
And we should probably introduce Roberto and Drew as they're new to the audience and newly joining this ideation team. So Roberto actually heads up the Tier 0 agency, and his nickname is Not Bob. That's what we're going to call him going for. And Drew D'Agostino heads up a personality, AI-driven personality assessment company, and is a Forbes 30 under 30 list maker. And he is called Cookies. You can see the Cookie Monster down there.
Awesome, thank you, Will. So I think we can go ahead and get started. And so we have yet another poll for the audience. Sorry, I zoomed out way too much. So what we're gonna do, you're actually gonna go back into Slack, and there is a new poll waiting for you. And so our question here is, which of these challenge questions do you want to explore more? And so you're actually going to be helping us out because we have to figure this out. We can't do all of them. We have to do one. So cast your vote in Slack, and we'll give about 2 minutes or so. And while you do that, our participants, meaning Bunny, Stretch, Cookies, Not Bob, and I think that was it, yeah? Yeah, and Willie. They're going to vote on Mural. And so we'll compare answers, and then we'll move forward from there.
the software that we're collaborating on is a tool called Mural. And so what you might notice about it is that you're able to use this as the agenda, as the collaboration space where we drop all the stickies, we collaborate, we move things around, we make a creative mess, but it organizes all of our thoughts and helps us to collaborate even though we're all in different places, like a virtual whiteboard.
All right, so I'm going to wrap up voting for this session. Don't worry, there'll be plenty of opportunity to vote later. All right, so we have two winners here. So the ones that had the most votes were, how might we continuously and easily collect information about the quality of organizational culture, team performance, and individual mindsets in a way that can inform decision-making for leaders and connect to financial metrics. And the other one that had the most votes was, how might we create a scalable system for employees and organizational leaders to develop relationships with each other that build empathy, mutual support, and understanding. And I'm actually curious, how did the Slack channel do? So I'll switch over. Awesome, it looks like here. If you go into the Slack group, I'll share my screen. It looks like we had the one with the most votes. Well, the only vote here was, how might we easily create thoughtful, flexible, and personalized growth journeys that fulfill individual employees within a team environment? So we are going to move forward with the two that got the most votes. Actually here, for the purposes of doing one concept poster, is our decider on the line?
I think I'll go with, how might we create a scalable system for employees and organizational leaders to develop relationships with each other that build empathy, mutual support, and understanding.
Awesome. So we're going to go with that. So what we're doing next is our concept poster. And so in some sessions, we've broken out into teams. In this instance, we're actually going to all work on this poster together. So with our participants here, Bunny, Not Bob, and Stretch. I don't believe Cookies is on. And yeah, so we're actually going to focus on the how might we question that move forward. So thank you for doing the honors, Bunny. So what we're going to do with the concept poster is actually conceptualize, how might this look as a solution? And I know this is very preliminary, it's very basic, but what we're gonna do, and you can look at the example here, for the next 20 minutes, we're actually gonna work together to fill out each of these boxes. And so if you look at this, the therapist chatbot as a purely unrelated example, we've clearly identified who's it for. It's for the CHRO. What problem does it solve? It's the problems that the CHRO feels undervalued. The CEO doesn't understand the CHRO. And the big idea is that it creates a therapist. It's a therapist chatbot that helps patch up differences between the CEO and the CHRO. It's a solution just for them. So Will, did you want to walk through the rest?
And so one of the things that we want to do is we want to think through, like, how would this practically work? So this is a joke. Obviously, it's intended, not to bias your thinking, and saying, like, we can train this chatbot on thousands of hours of couples therapy sessions, and then what we do is we send it using a passive aggressive email to the CEO, and after both the CHRO and CEO use the chatbot, we'll survey them to see how they feel and how their thoughts about the other have improved. Based on that, we'll tweak the model and deploy to more people and continuously improve it. Why might it fail? Well, people may not get emotional nourishment from machines, or the CEOs won't use it. So, and then we have to figure out, like, we don't just want to build something, we want to prototype and test it. So what do we prototype and test? Well, maybe a simple exchange about how CHROs and CEOs feel about each other, and a survey to see how they've patched things up. And how do we measure success? We don't want to head off without knowing where we're going. Well, improved survey performance is one thing, and maybe a reduction in number of holes punched in the office drywall. It'll cost about $1 trillion, and it'll be done in 3 months. No big deal.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. So we're going to dive into our own concept poster here. Please don't feel confined to feel like you have to do another chatbot. That was purely just an example, a very outlandish one. Okay, so I can just drag this over here just for ease. I'll bring this down here so you can see it. So I won't walk you through each and every one of these because I want you to have the freedom to be able to work on it. So you feel free to discuss amongst yourselves. And yeah, so we already know that it's either designed for the CHRO or the hesitant contributor. So this is a given here, but I'll let you guys take care of the rest.
And so everyone on Slack, if you've got any thoughts that you see as this is unfolding that you think our participants would like to hear that might inform the way that they're thinking, go ahead and chime that in. But participants, feel free to talk amongst each other to figure out how it is that you want to make this work. All right, so the question is, how might we create a scalable system for employees and organizational leaders to develop relationships with each other that build empathy, mutual support, and understanding? Like, so what are some of the things that keep that from happening? Then what might we do to actually prevent, to solve that?
So Nicole, am I trying to type in something right now, or are we talking it out?
Yeah, so we're going to talk it out. Yeah,
oh, okay.
This is a discussion,
We're
yeah. That's what I tried to prompt you,
Yeah, and actually I wanted to go with, I want to return to something that somebody on Slack had mentioned, a question about how to design safe spaces, and it kind of relates to what we're doing right now, the how might we, and somebody was saying that sometimes when you design a safe space for a group of people, it might not feel safe for another group of people. So in a way, you end up having these silos, you having these tribal, issues again. But how do we find a way that everybody feels like they made out, with the gold, like that everybody's voice got to be heard in the way that they wanted it to be. And all I know is that, just to give it a concrete example, because people did ask, what do you mean by safe space? Like, at least over where I work at Wellesley Centers for Women, there's a lot of group work that we do, a lot of processing and bring people of many different perspectives. Even though we're all women, it's basically 99% a workplace of women. But there's a lot of different cognitive diversity and perspectives within this group of women. And one of the first things we do are, okay, what are the rules that we have for this particular meeting? One of the rules could be assume that the other person isn't attacking you. So that could help with being, the whole defensiveness thing. Maybe they're just talking about their personal experience, but they're not saying that because we had different experiences that they are against you somehow.
Right.
That kind of thing. And so that helps with feeling like your ears are open, not worried that somebody's gonna say something that'll offend you, and just to kind of put it out there that let's assume that we aren't trying to offend each other. And it might seem like a really simple request and obvious, but sometimes we have to remind ourselves that, we're bringing ourselves to work with a lot of baggage, some days more than others, some days feeling more sensitive about certain things than others. And sometimes the safe space, we just have to put it out there. Other things are, in order to feel like there's mutual respect in a room, everybody needs to put their phone away. So that's something that is really hard to require people to do, but everybody has to agree to it because It's a rule that everybody needs to come up with. So those are just some examples.
I would, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying, thank you. Go ahead, Stretch.
So the nickname is because I'm tall ish. That's where stretch comes from. So I would say, and sometimes in group dynamics, we can all do this where there are certain voices that we kind of lean into. And so when they come up with an idea, we're thinking through, and even if we don't understand what they're saying at first or are following, we're kind of following up to see, oh, what did you mean by that? Then there may be other folks who, when they speak up, we're kind of like, oh, okay. And then you move on to the next thing. So I think just being really cognizant of that, because, you know, I've personally we've all been in situations like that, either the person who's done that or been on the receiving end. So I think just being cognizant of listening, giving each voice equal weight, each idea equal weight, and sort of just asking a follow-up question just as a practice to kind of say, oh, what did you mean by that? Or that's interesting, how could you expand? In stopping ourselves from kind of going to the voices that we typically lean on for input.
Awesome, thank you. I just added that over here.
And so, Stephanie from the Slack channel says that whatever the solution should be, you know, maybe it should take into account that those with greater power should take greater responsibility. A subordinate always has less power and therefore has to be careful in using their agency.
I think it's a great point. I think it's an absolutely great point, and that there is a lot of onus on leadership to say, this is a safe space. And when it comes from, or if it comes from more junior folks, people who don't feel like they have that agency, it can come across as friction rather than, you know, just the rules of the road. So yes, there definitely is more of an onus on leadership to say, you know, this is what each of us are great at, but, you know, we're going to put that to the side for a bit and just talk and not work towards what the next deliverable is, but working through this problem, and we'll get to the deliverable after that discussion. So yeah, I do think a lot of the onus is on leadership, but not only. I think a lot of things come from junior folks saying, hey, there's another way to think about this, and kind of continuing to tap and kind of break down those silos.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, and with that hesitant contributor persona, I would say that if there's a kind of a minority group in there where you feel like you're all feeling hesitant because you're new, you feel insecure, you're feeling like a fraud, that sometimes it's good to think of yourselves as not just individuals trying to make your voice heard, but also as allies and advocates for somebody else. So let's say your friend is very soft-spoken, said some brilliant idea that everybody kind of passed over and they didn't really quite hear, but then somebody else says the same idea and tries to take credit for it. You could also kind of chime in and be like, well, you know what? That's something that that person had already said in a different way, and just kind of chime in and be an advocate and ally. So it's not just everybody out for themselves, but sort of like, this is how you build teams, this is how you raise voices, not just of yourself, but other people that might have felt like their voice wasn't heard and then they felt shut down, and that they're going to feel even more withdrawn. So this could help other people out too.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And let me provide some additional context about the question. And so a lot of the problems that we uncovered were that if you are a woman or a person of color or someone very junior, you tend to have to do a lot of work to form alliances across the company. But especially if you're new to the working world, you might not play politics very well. And the fact is that, you know, the people at the higher ranks of the organization have kind of forgotten what it's like to be on the front line sometimes. And they might not have empathy for the frontline employees, but at the same time, the employees don't necessarily have empathy for the people higher up the ranks and don't understand the kind of pressures that they're under, the situations that make them do that. But they need those people to support them, to advance their careers and to understand them. You know, so what are some ways that we can actually, you know, make it easier for, you know, people to navigate the vagaries of corporate politics, to be able to actually get to know each other, to empathize with each other and create a system that makes that happen, rather than relying on chance encounters or one person being better at politics than another person? How do we level that playing field? What do you think, not Bob?
I was thinking about, so we worked with Fox many years ago, and it was at a time when the department we were working at sought to try and break down some of the barriers to be it empathy or understanding amongst their teams. And, you know, this is the analog version of it, but they had everyone do a Briggs-Myers test. Each letter then ended up, each of your letter combinations then ended up as a color-coded cube, which everyone had to have on the corner of their desk. So that the moment someone walked into an office or by a cubicle, they had some sense of the person on the other side, to immediately kind of give a look into the way they think and feel and find synergies or otherwise. So what is the 2020 version of that as a way to somehow share, like fast forward the path to empathy, rather than maintaining these walls whereby we naturally fear an unknown other? First part. Second thing I was thinking about is I do quite a bit of business in Japan. And Japanese drinking culture. I'm getting feedback. Are you getting it?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, so Japanese drinking culture is part of the salaryman's work. And that means that, you know, it's a function of the fact that most people are with a corporation for 20 to 30 years. Building those tight bonds between employees is so important. And so every night after work, when they finish at 8, the next 4 hours are spent drinking with your colleagues. Now, this isn't me promoting alcoholism at the enterprise level. The most interesting part of it is that there's one of the rules that go along with it is that the conversations that are had during those drinking sessions with your boss, none of it counts tomorrow. So you have a forum to speak freely with no repercussions the next day. Now, that is something that's been heavily ingrained in their culture over decades, but it is at least an example of a forum to both bond and enable those precarious conversations.
Awesome. I want to touch upon that, not Bob. You said, so more or less, it's an environment or it's a space where you can bond in a not just a safe environment, but you said
without repercussions.
Without repercussions, exactly. So what does
or without negative ones? There may be positive ones to the extent you found a willing ear.
Right. So what would this system look like? A system for employees and organizational leaders to develop these relationships. And we've identified a lot of good characteristics and traits that we want to promote and things that we want to avoid and things to be aware of, like bringing your baggage to work more days than the others or what have you, because it's human. And so we just have to be reminded of our humanity. And with that being said, what might this system look like? Is this something that's more or less a literal space? Is this something that is more or less something that promotes a mindset? Is this a solution that could be integrated in the everyday of an employee of a large enterprise? I'm just throwing things out there. What does this look like to you? And then what might we call this? So we're over here in this box now. What is the big idea?
So whatever it is, it probably shouldn't be, constrained by, the physical space, because one of our Slack participants said that, it's actually physical distance that causes a lot of these problems. So at least some component of it should not rely on physical proximity. And so whatever it is probably also has to, accomplish what Not Bob was saying in terms of creating sort of a safe space to speak without freedom, to speak without fear of repercussion. Anybody have any other thoughts about what this needs to do to make this work?
How do you, typically when you walk into a company environment, all you know about someone before you walk in there is their name and title, possibly, the part of the business that is their jurisdiction. Will and Nicole, when we were thinking about this in the context of virtualizing conference experiences, Will, you sort of promoted this idea of almost sending out a survey beforehand so as to better match participants. What other data should or can corporations share employee to employee to both, I guess, to make those steps towards empathy and possibly commonality to the extent they, both like the Dave Matthews Band.
Right. That's actually something Sean Madere pointed out on Slack. He said, how can we create structures for submitting ideas that can be accessed from all levels of the organizations, and pathways for internal teams, to form and pitch ideas that would create new values. So how do you kind of create that safe flow of information for, as well as, human interaction to build empathy?
Well, I'll jump in and I'll say, I think it starts with asking. And, it's kind of not, once you ask the question, at least speaking from my perspective at Forbes, when people are asked, hey, what do you think? Everyone is quick to kind of give their opinion. So I think the first step is asking the question. And then the second and most important step is for the people who are asking to put something in, to put it into practice in some way, or show that, that effort of folks putting their ideas on the line, which is not always easy to step up and say, hey, this is an idea I stand behind, recognizing that that's not an easy process, and then kind of doing their part to implement it or show how it might be implemented in the future. So I think just having the thought in mind of how it could possibly be implemented before putting the ask out is important, just to make sure that people feel like, okay, if I stick my neck out and share an idea, that it's going to be heard and potentially, followed through on.
Right. Linda, I think you were going to say something.
Yes, I was going to say something about, that persona of the HR person who doesn't feel empowered and feels like a middle person perhaps. And in order to maybe get more sort of cred with people kind of that they are hiring and trying to manage difficult personalities, I feel that a lot of times management seems to want to be the masterminds of the puzzles, putting people together. They think that they know better in a way that would create a certain solution, a certain atmosphere, a certain attitude. But you want to maybe always tap into the teams that these new people will be placed in. And so having more of a lateral structure or some kind of more group input into who gets to join the team and what are the gaps that you're looking for. Are you trying to look for somebody who is complementary to the team, or you want to get somebody that is going to keep reinforcing some of the things that are already working well, but we just need more hands on deck? Just sort of talking through what your joint goals are in diversifying a team together as much as possible on many different levels, from senior to junior, and including the junior person in the interviewing process as well, so that they know how they were even selected for this team, to remind them that they are now getting more senior because there's more junior people coming in. It can kind of empower people and to have them think of themselves as advancing in the organization along the way. So just an idea for that persona.
Absolutely, and we've gotten some interesting feedback as well through Slack. I'm not going to call out everybody, but I'm going to coalesce some of it with some of the things that you've all been saying, which is, it sounds like, we need to create, a safe flow of information and human interaction throughout the organization to build empathy. It sounds like we need to create a way to give to sort of get more people to have a seat at the table. I think there might be some interesting ways to do that. So are there ways that we could take some of the decision making out of the hands of biased managers who pick those teams, while still giving them, some comfort with what's going on?
So
I mean, have you guys?
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, are you familiar with Tony Hsieh's move towards holacracy years ago?
Yes, with Zappos.
Yeah. Look, they've since moved on to market-based dynamics, but that was at least an interesting move towards flattening an organization and effectively shifting both the power base and the decisioning onto the people who actually run the front lines affecting the change. The next step on that was obviously, like I said, market-based dynamics, where each of the groups is now responsible for their own P&Ls, and they can leverage their skill sets to both service the mothership or be entrepreneurial. And, for example, the Zappos HR department is also the outsourced HR group for the Las Vegas Knights. But again, that's an extension of the sort of notion of holacracy.
So you're mentioning that these smaller groups or these dedicated groups are responsible for not only their own P&L, but other specific initiatives as well, apart from their...
Yeah, well, the P&L has only come later with the market-based dynamics thesis. But yeah, in terms of decisioning and transparency around roles and responsibilities, and obviously KPIs as a part of that was the process that they went through.
Got it. So I want to call out one very interesting comment from the Slack channel, and I think it more or less ties everything together. So Andre actually mentioned that safe spaces, sure, they can exist in an organization, but it originates from a group, but ultimately it originates from yourself. So a safe space can't happen unless you recognize that in yourself, that you come with your own bias, and you come with your own baggage, like Linda was saying. And also, so we're highlighting a lot of individual initiative that you could take here, but how do you harness that? How do you enable that? And how do you encourage that? And so I'm hearing a lot about lateral structures, not just the safe space within yourself, but being enabled by smaller groups that are responsible for their own decision making. So I feel like it's more or less a flow. It's more or less a flow of, if this is onboarding, let's say, let's take a look at the user journey. If I were a new employee and I was trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to make this new hire or allow them to feel more empowered without them feeling like they're at the point where they're questioning, like, oh no, why did I get hired here? Why did I choose this organization over the other? You never want them to get to that point. So it's always just instilling those checkpoints. And I think Sade or Stretch was talking about it, where how do you implement those things before, how do you implement that without making that ask? Like, it shouldn't have to be so reactive. It has to be proactive. And so how do you put these systems in place? And so it sounds to me that it's the systems could already be there. It's about putting the puzzle pieces together, right? And so I feel that it could be that it's the flow of really like what it would look like with that whole customer journey of someone that was being onboarded to a new company, and how are you going to promote these safe spaces, beginning with smaller groups so they can decide their roles and responsibilities, and as a collective rather than just being out for yourself. Am I making any sense? And so I'm just putting these Post-its together here. And so ultimately, what would this concept be called? Like, what would we call this? Would it be more or less like the ideal Like an empathetic onboarding process that really emphasizes professional development, that contributes to the longer term solution of instilling a particular mindset with an organization, because it starts with your people.
Yeah, what you're doing.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Okay, I'll just quickly say, I think maybe part of it is when we were talking about the lateral structure and looking more at linear organizations, I think the onboarding process is a position to do that, because you're by default there's a power dynamic in a company and the person who wants to get hired. So if you, as the company, automatically instill that, obviously we have something you want, but you also have something we want, and just making it feel like a mutually beneficial relationship from the start, and kind of showing that the power is not being used in a way that would make the person who's trying to get into the company feel uncomfortable, I think is one way to establish that, just in terms of basic communication, emails, phone calls, how the interview is structured, that kind of thing.
I love that.
Yeah, so on that note of the onboarding process, I think it definitely sets the stage for the tone of how they're going to feel at this company. Are they going to feel welcomed, from the get-go? Are they going to have to find their way, find their tribe? One thing I was thinking about in terms of how do we frame it so it feels safe, and yet you want to encourage innovation and risk taking, because you have these new ideas that's why they brought you on. We're going to assume that you are not just another warm body and another pair of hands to do work. We are going to assume that you're here because you fill this gap that they've been looking for, and but that you don't want to ruin that mystique that you had, by saying something wrong, saying something that was not politically as correct as it could have been. I was thinking just that notion of growth mindset. And I know it's something that they do in the schools nowadays, where you basically are allowed to experiment and try things out, and you may not have gotten the solution quite yet, but you can start forming your ideas, thinking out loud, brainstorming, and it's embedded in the whole process that this is all draft, and it's okay to kind of say something that isn't fully fleshed out and formed, but it could be that somebody else is going to take that half idea and add another fourth to the idea, and then another person is going to come in and be like, oh my gosh, that's the missing piece that I've been thinking about to help form that idea. And so in a way, thinking about it as that we're growing you onto our team, and you're going to start planting seeds. You're one of the seeds, and we're going to grow together. We don't know what's going to happen. Some things may need a little bit more watering, and some things may need a little bit more light, but just sort of that kind of mentality to make people feel that there's going to be some growth curve happening, and that's natural, but no matter what, we're gonna be here with you. We're not gonna just be eagle-eyeing you to see, oh, are you still worth our hire? Are you still worth your space in this cubicle? So that's just my idea about the onboarding process.
I love that. Please forgive me if I'm getting this completely wrong and convoluted, but what I'm hearing is, if I were trying to make it succinct, to a general idea and what it would be called, this is looking like an onboarding roadmap, or it doesn't have to be about onboarding per se, because what about the current employees, right? So it's all about the act of creating a very clear journey, a clear roadmap, where it's really instilling that mutually beneficial mindset. And I added in that space for experimentation, because when you do feel like you have that separate, that idea that you're not so constrained by it because you're not allowed to make any mistakes, therefore that makes you afraid to speak out, as you were saying earlier. So it's a roadmap that really bakes in that space for experimentation, and also lets you like co-create this together with the employer or the organization that you're with. There's lots of different employment styles now. There's so many, like there's a lot of freelancers now. There's a lot of contractors. There's not everyone is necessarily a 100% full-time permanent employee anymore. And so we have to be mindful of accommodating different working styles and working arrangements, and also really trying to make this relevant for the CHROs that are out there and those contributors that are hesitant, which could be people that sit outside the organizations. They could be partners as well. So, it's looking like a roadmap. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Linda, there's one thing that that you were saying during, I think, the Q&A period. You were pointing out that, you know, a shared task can be a bridge to empathy and to understanding, kind of like, you know, this shared task that we're going through right now is a bridge to empathy and understanding. Does that play in at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of it's not us versus them. It's not the juniors versus the seniors. It's about we're all on the same team. We're all on the boat. We're all going to, you know, sort of, you know, sink if this boat is not doing well. Some people will be affected more, you know, quickly than others, of course. But yeah, there's that shared empathy of everybody has that that chance to bring in that input after considering all the different varieties of sort of the progress that has already been made on a task, and to kind of see if they could add to that mix, and to not feel afraid that saying some kind of outlandish or outside the box idea is going to pigeonhole them to being that person, the person that everybody's like, oh, rolling their eyes at whenever they bring out their idea. But sometimes they are pretty brilliant, you know, like those wacky ideas. And also, I mean, something that brings together a lot of people and helps break tension in the room is definitely like helping everybody kind of bring the humor back into meetings, you know, like just sort of remember that, you know, we're all here trying with our best, and to just sort of not take everything so, you know, okay, if I don't say the exact right thing, I'm going to be fired. You know, that's if people are always afraid at that level, then they'll always be in this heightened state. And so if other people can notice that in the room that somebody's looking terrified, somebody's looking like they're a shrunken flower in the room, you can kind of give them that little boost that, oh, you know, that other day when you mentioned that idea, can you kind of flesh that out a little bit, because I was thinking about it yesterday and how I think you have something there. And, you know, there's so many different ways to kind of boost morale, like in very, very little, you know, all these different little points, so that all the voices could kind of shine.
I love that. Thank you so much. So I was trying to jot down some of what you were saying, and trying to put it in a sense of how is it going to help us measure success. We talked about this earlier about instilling or incorporating specific checkpoints. I have no better word for this. Perhaps instilling a few checkpoints that to replace the traditional KPIs, because we're not machines. Our performance isn't measured or meant to be measured by utility, as I know some companies still do. So how might we actually measure success along the lines of focusing on fulfillment? And fulfillment is something that's very subjective. I completely understand that. And so that could be something that's more fleshed out and more defined. What does fulfillment mean to an organization and its employees, and vice versa? And also personal development toward the long term, and also paying it forward, because how are you actually establishing that cycle, the scalable cycle that you want to return back into your organization, rather than just being a purely linear process. So I feel that that's the way that's really going to scale. It's if the individuals are looking toward actually making those spaces, those actual spaces within their organizations, an actual safe space, rather than just theoretically or just having it as a nice idea, if that makes sense.
I love that. We also had James Callistra add a suggestion in. He says, what if there were a way to better assess cognitive diversity, whether it's a test, however that works, and then part of the roadmap is each individual is assigned a personal advisory board made of a cognitively diverse group of people who can help answer questions they have or bounce ideas from different perspectives.
Yeah, I think it's a great thought, because I mean, part of what's inherent in that question is that this is not a natural process for any of us. And I think that's fair to say, and I think that's okay. So whereas this may be supernatural, very natural to folks in particular fields or kinds of organizations, I think for a lot of us, it's just not a natural thing that we think about when we're in our meetings and going through our day-to-day. So I think that's an awesome idea to sort of, like we do anything else, we codify it and put it into practice. And then hopefully with something like this, it's something that becomes more natural in the way that we think about people when we're inviting people into the room, asking ourselves who's not here, why, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that's putting it into practice like that is an awesome step.
Hmm.
So I'm going to add that in here. It's this roadmap. I'm going to remove mutually beneficial because that's implied here. It's this roadmap that has individual checkpoints, where each part of the roadmap is assigned like a quote unquote personal advisory board made up of cognitively diverse people, to balance like the different perspectives. How do we make that concise, guys? Roadmap with a space of, let's see. There's like a cognitive diversity test that was mentioned. And I'm going to put quotes around tests because we've had conversations that assessments and tests aren't always conducive to people of various backgrounds, and we should always give different formats that people could actually showcase their talent and their skill sets and who they are as a person, not just how many words they can type, and and trying to do things as efficiently as possible.
I had a question for everybody out there about cognitive tests. Do organizations usually reveal what your answers are? I mean, how do they categorize you? And then is it made known to your superiors? And I mean, how much is privacy an issue, and how much in the the business world, the corporate world? I'm not usually in that world. Like how much is it something that could be used as an asset as opposed to just at the hiring time period? I mean, that's a secret sort of activity.
Shada, you want to talk to that, or should I, or not, Bob? And Stretch, I shouldn't have called you.
You can go ahead, Willie.
Okay, so there's a lot of companies that use it very differently, but most of the time it's used as sort of a way to make hiring managers' jobs easier. There's 1,000 people that will apply for something. They need to screen it somehow, and they think, well, fine, what's easy on me? I'll make them take a test, and that's going to be one of the ways that they do that. They will end up using that data sometimes to inform senior managers about what goes on, but many times those senior managers actually don't know how to read it, don't have the capacity to understand it, and they just want like what are the details. But the privacy concern is a big deal, and so however we're supposed to get a sense of how people are cognitively diverse, how do you do that in a way that doesn't tell things that shouldn't be told to people who shouldn't know them?
Mm-hmm. I asked because one of my favorite work retreats was when they had us do a sorting task, like a personality task that sorted us into 4 different kinds of people. And then at the end, we had to go to those corners of the room. And then you revealed what kind of a style you had, a cognitive style that you had. And I remember even though some people were very grumpy about it and resistant, and I just remember feeling like I saw people in a whole new way after I saw which group they were in, and that I thought that some people who were more similar to me were actually a lot more different, and vice versa. That there's some people that I never thought would be like me were in the same group as me, and I've carried that experience with me for quite a long time in a very positive way. I don't know how other people might feel about that, but these kinds of these sort of self-selecting, you know, you are the one that's in control of what other people see about you. It's kind of empowering, and in a way it felt like everybody had to go and show their pride. I'm in group C, or I'm in group, you know, A, and you got to understand people on a different level.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And so for the audience who's been following us very closely, we really appreciate you doing that and providing your suggestions, which have been extremely helpful. So thank you for that. What we're going to do now, since you've been paying such close attention, we're going to call on you for your feedback. So here, I'm going to scroll over to what we call our rose, thorn, and bud exercise. So it's a really fancy way of just note-taking. But we have it color-coded in such a way where it would be very easy for you to provide your feedback and very easy for us to incorporate it. And so Gary is actually going to drop the instructions in the Slack channel for your reference in case I'm going through this too fast. But please feel free to glaze over this. Let's go to the instructions. Okay, so what you're going to do is color code. Well, we're going to color code on Slack, and we realize that you don't have sticky notes there. So what you're going to do is actually, for the particular concept poster that we were just working on together, you're going to tell us what you observe that you feel very strongly about would really, really work, what part of the concept that you find is going to work. The thorn is going to be more or less something that you feel like, you know, is a little bit debatable. You're not really sure if this is going to work without a little bit of extra care. And the bud is something that needs, you know, a little bit more time to be developed. We got to put more thought into it, but it's an interesting idea. So how we would like for you to actually structure this when you're providing the feedback in the Slack channel is start by the word rose, thorn, or bud, and then your piece of feedback. And so we'll give you about 3 minutes or so to do that. And I'll put a timer here. Great work, everyone. This looks so good. Some of the feedback that we're going to get from the Slack channel are obviously some constructive criticism. And so we'll incorporate that to the square here. Why might it fail? And so we believe this exercise is really important because it really provides the space for discourse and debate. And so before you go off trying to build a new product or a new solution, you really have to look at it from all angles. And it's very helpful to get that from the people who are not closest to the idea. You've often heard about people falling in love with their own idea and they hold on to it so closely that even when people give a lot of different constructive feedback, constructive, positive, and more challenging feedback, so very often the trajectory doesn't change because people just happen to fall in love with their ideas. And there's a less likelihood for us to do that when we actually source the constructive criticism, the discourse, and the debate with you, the audience, and also the varying perspectives of our very diverse group here. So thank you ahead of time. So we have about 1.5 minutes left, and then we'll wrap it up and move on. And while people think through that, I think it is important that we do our own criticism. And so I think it gives us an opportunity to look at it. So I'll go back to the instructions over here. So let's just go down the line and we can start with our members. So Bunny, why might you think this, such a hard question, but why do you think this might fail?
And right now, I'm sorry, I have too many things open, so many windows. Okay. I mean, I think you actually mentioned earlier about how there's so many different kinds of companies and so many different issues that like an HR person would be faced, especially considering consultants and external, people who are part-time, people on different flex schedules. And I think there could be, a lot of it is the culture from the top that may not be completely on board with this kind of, it's almost like it has to start from somebody who already believes in this, as opposed to, okay, let's get this external consultant to teach somebody how to be, to change their managing style, to be very inclusive and to care about all the employees and their well-being. I think there's a lot of red tape and some resistance, possibly, for even just the utility of this, of even just mutual respect, and the goal of everybody feeling valued. I think if you really came down to how much somebody values that at the upper end of the company, there'd be some wide range in that. Sometimes people's actions speak louder than the words. I mean, it sounds good to say it, but then what do they do about it?
So there's less action, there's less consideration for it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or maybe just some more drop in the bucket kind of efforts. Okay, I'm gonna do this once a year thing and I'm gonna check that box, that kind of thing. It's easier to do that.
Just checking off the boxes, right? Yeah. And not to only focus on the negative, but why do you think that this is actually a feasible idea and that this would actually lead to a successful implementation?
Well, I kind of have this hunch that the people on this Slack channel already are a little bit in the choir, and they already know that this is important. And so I think that the people that are here would be more willing and able to kind of take whatever ideas that they want to try to implement into their organization at whatever level that they have, and do whatever's feasible for them. And to me that's gives me a lot of hope. I think if we were talking to an audience of people that really had to be convinced that diversity is important, for instance, that would be already, it would feel like a lot bigger of an uphill battle. So I think there's a lot of, I think there are nuggets that people can take. I mean, I think of your own situation, what would be feasible and something that you would want to carry on, and maybe you can get a partner to kind of ideate with and say, okay, I really like this one part. Can you help me team up with me, and we can like brainstorm on how we can get it done in our context. So I think every little step counts, even if you can't do the whole entire, concept map of it all.
Exactly. So we're going to get to the bud if we do have time, but Stretch, did you want to add on to what are some reasons that some parts of this initiative might be debatable and what might make it more feasible?
Sure. I would add maybe the day-to-day pressures that come with being an executive, specifically if it's a HR executive, kind of the personnel issues that inevitably come up often. So that could be kind of something that prohibits this, but shouldn't, of course. And then what makes this feasible is that I think at every level, there are people who want to participate and who have really amazing things to say and contribute. And if they just know that the space is there and safe for them to do that, then they will. and just going back to, making the ask, saying, what do you think? Those things are easy to do if they are kind of driven by a genuine interest in the other person and making the organization better. So I think it's an easy solve in the sense that you can make it more, it's easy to make it more open as an executive because you have that power.
Got it. Thank you. And not Bob, did you want to contribute as well?
Sure. Two thoughts with regards to why it might fail. A lack of tie back to the underlying business. I think until we can sort of show the upside of creating these, be it roadmap journeys or this empathetic ecosystem, it will just end up being a one-off without the buy-in support. And we just talked about a flat organization, but a top-down mandate. By the same token, I think its feasibility comes when we look back to the business drivers for it as well, especially when we look at enterprises and the difficulty that many of them have in trying to do anything in a cross-functional manner, or even more so for larger enterprises when we start to think about trying to put anything in market that touches multiple lines of business. So that almost feels like the place to start in grounding a business case for this. It is a felt need out there, and could indeed overcome our initial necessary condition, which is tie it back to the mainline business to justify getting the attention and mandate it deserves.
Got it. Thank you. Awesome. And so I really do think that it's important that we consider all these things because, like I said, we can't fall in love with our own ideas, but also we're very keenly aware of any obstacles that might be ahead. So we're actually looking at realistically, what might the hurdles be? And so we're not just blindly walking toward a solution, but we're actually considering all different angles, all different sides of what might be a roadblock and how can we actually work through this together without investing a lot of the time, money, and effort without trying to test the right things. And so, yeah, so thank you for contributing that. And yeah, so I think with the time that we have left, we'd love to skip over to our storyboarding. And so this is the fun part. And so we're going to use more or less the rest of the time here to draw through these workflows. And so I think we have a huge advantage here because we've been talking a lot about roadmaps and a lot about this journey. And so we've already been mentally preparing ourselves for thinking about the journey. And what we're going to do, I think it would be helpful if I scrolled up. So we're going to think about this workflow in terms of how might this look like to an individual? What would these steps look like? And so it's really helpful to do it in a comic book style. So you can either draw, you can use Giphies, you can use icons, what have you. And we actually have instructions here if you scroll and zoom in. So you can, there are like some tips, like you can draw an arrow by holding C and drag. You can look at the panel on your left-hand side on your mural to add pictures or Giphies. Or you can also click on the pencil here to draw if you're an artist. I avoid that one at all costs, so I'll stick with the words and the stickies. So yeah, what we were going to do was actually split into two groups, but actually, I think we've been working so well together, so we're just gonna stick with one storyboard here. So I will step back, I will not draw, but I'm more than happy to type when it comes to like your steps here. And so just really imagine it like a comic book. And so we can go down the line and just feel free to jump in. I think it's easiest if you start with the first and the last pane. So pane as in window pane or like the drawing pane. So yeah, you can think about where we start and where we finish, and we can fill in everything in between. So that makes it a lot easier. So who wants to do the honors and jump in?
What's the first step somebody takes in this journey? How do they find the solution that we're building?
Maybe they get referred. Maybe it's a referral to this company, perhaps.
Okay, I think that might be a good place to start.
It's a referral from a cognitively diverse employee.
Okay, so they've been referred. Then what happens after they've been referred to the company?
So they're applying and taking those personality tests at the HR.
Yeah.
And they're talking to, and if they make it to the interview stage, they're talking to all levels of their potential team. So not just HR, but a couple of their potential colleagues, their supervisor, some people that they would supervise potentially.
Right. And so how would this be different with what we're designing? So when they're having those talks with colleagues and with people up and down the chain, how would we think about that differently than what you might see in a normal process?
See, so maybe there'd be a system to make sure that everybody's input is considered in a way that isn't just hierarchical.
Okay.
I mean, because some of these exercises are just to get it done, and it doesn't actually feed into any of the decision making. It's just part of the list of things that need to happen.
Right. And interesting. So what's the next step?
So I'm thinking that this person is competing for the job. So in a way, these people have to maybe start to rank all these people, and maybe the criteria in which they're ranking them have to do with how well they'll add to the cognitive diversity of the team. I don't know.
Okay, so after we've ranked them and the way that their cognitive diversity will add to the team, what's next? How do we know that it'll add to the team? What do we do? Or how do you think is the next step in the process? Stretch, not Bob. What are your thoughts? What happens next after we rank them according to cognitive diversity?
Quick question. What sort of enterprise are we building this for? Is it a large enterprise with multiple disciplines within it, or a sort of smaller build? Because the answer may change. Even our slide 2, rather than speaking to a lack of hierarchy, would also speak to a multidisciplinary, I guess, interview process. So you're touching all parts of the organization as well.
No, so we designed this for it's an 1,000-person plus company.
Okay.
So what does that next step look like? The ranking criteria is based on how it contributes to the cognitive diversity on the team. And then after that, and keep in mind, this is the ideal journey. Pretend that there are no barriers. Pretend that you could design this and it would exist tomorrow. And in an ideal world, this is how it should be.
Maybe
I almost wonder.
Go ahead.
I almost wonder if the people who are advocates, like let's say there's different groups of people that were in the interview process who are advocating for different candidates. And it almost seems like, because the more you communicate about why you have a certain solution or you have an idea, the more everybody will maybe get to a consensus in a way. Like, so you have different groups of people, like different corners, like saying, okay, I want candidate 1, this person wants candidate 2, this person wants candidate 3, and they kind of have an exchange of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think discourse should definitely be, if it's not implied, should definitely be in here as a next step.
Would that be part of the ranking process?
I think the ranking process, it could almost be individual, because then it helps them feel not coerced. So it could be like a poll, you know, you can just privately give people their answer, but then it could be a group process after that. I don't know, just an idea.
I feel like step 3 is more data driven in terms of how that could be completely removed from the actual discourse. Like Stretch was saying, like there has to be an actual, like, looking at it from different angles, kind of like the rose, thorn, and bud exercise we just went through. We'd have to do this with candidates or people working with the company as well. So what would the next step be after we've had plenty of discourse, plenty of debate? What would this look like? Would we want to see them in action, basically? Or would we want,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
What's the test phase look like in terms of, we know that the no test on cognitive function or diversity will give us a true picture. It'll give us a good picture, but not a full picture of mind in action. And you can only get so much in a series of rushed interviews. How do we set up a forum to actually see this in action? I mean, you know, McKinsey does a version of this where you're basically brought in, get through a series of interviews, and you're actually given real life or real life adjacent problems to solve in the room with, you know, your would-be team as part of their interview process.
So something very similar to what we're doing now, like literally this
Yes.
we're doing
This.
Awesome. So, i.e., an ideation session. I mean, that just opens up a lot of different ranges of possibilities. And I know someone in a Slack channel mentioned something very similar to this, just incorporating the design thinking process in the journey. And so this is a direct use case for that. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and to draw on James Callistra's earlier point, you know, maybe there's a way that, you know, the people that are around the table, there's some sort of longer term relationship that's formed.
It could be like a mentor
fit.
mentee.
If there's a fit, yeah, obviously if it moves forward, but that's not the next step.
Like I think a mentor mentee kind of thing. I don't know if a lot of companies consider that as, that could be an advantage, because then you have your advocate already that they have just, that they want to have that as their informal, you know, expectation, not because somebody signed to them, but because they wanted to be a mentor to the next person. So then you have that safe space already as somebody that's in your court. And that person could be the first person you go to when you want to register a complaint, possibly too. So that that's your go-to personal space. I mean, safety net, who won't rat you out if you're feeling like, you know, you're being very vulnerable with some kind of a weak spot that you have identified in your in your work life.
It's kind of like how you were saying, Bob, a place where you could just express your concerns candidly and
Yep.
not feel like you'd have to keep quiet. So yeah, so like a confidant. Yeah, exactly. And so beyond that, is this where the checkpoints come in, do you think? Do you think that this journey should be exclusive between mentor and mentee? Or should that be the beginning of like basically establishing, because is the relationship only with that confidant, or is it with what the organization stands for? How do you build that attachment with human qualities that the organization wants to embody? Is it through a series of checkpoints with different people, or is this something that is really up to the individual for them to seek out?
And that's an interesting question, because I can imagine some people would prefer a consistent person, the go-to, and other people might want a variety. Some people don't want to rely on one person. They love the diversity of perspectives that other people could bring, even people that will challenge them more. So that brings in the, how even just the preference of the applicant could come into play.
There's an upside to the latter, I think, in variety, where if we take the hotel management school approach, where you're there to become the manager of the hotel, but in doing so, you spend some time in housekeeping, some time in room service, some time in landscaping and concierge, whatever it might be. Because no matter what task you're there to do, having the ability to spread that footprint will both give you greater business context, regardless of what discrete function you're performing within it. And guess what? You're going to meet a bunch more people along the way and actually interact with them in the minds and experiences that are the basis of relationship and therefore empathy.
Oh, exactly. Oh, go ahead. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and speaking of that, because we know that it's important for people's futures to develop these relationships and alliances across the company, even if they might prefer, to just stick with what they know, it might be better to give them a chance to push their comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, and that speaks to, if you want to enforce a culture of, kind of breaking down silos and not sticking just in your subject matter of expertise.
Right, right. And so, that gives me a thought. So the research of John Hagel looks at sort of that the teams that actually do the real work are those teams actually are not, formal teams at all. They're the people who reach across and just sort of handle exceptions to get things done, and they've formed relationships sort of through this way. So is there a way that sort of these, networks actually formalize into working groups at some point?
They are working groups. They're just not official working groups.
Right. Is there a way they become more formal and then, measured and tracked?
That's a good point.
Yeah, I was in a networking sort of an organization that tried to help us learn how to network with our colleagues with diverse colleagues to expand our perspectives. And what they would do is they would track it by asking, okay, after each of these coaching sessions, each of these meetings that we had, these different symposia, like how many people did you reach out to? Who did you talk to? What was their helpful advice? And what would so they would always sort of be making sure that the point of these events was coming through, that people were staying in touch and they were getting that mentoring that they needed. And maybe just to track that, I can see it could be an interesting way to add it to an evaluation survey in the HR context, in terms of satisfaction with your job. Like, how much are people reaching out to help you out, and how much you're feeling able to reach out to other people. And it could be like a checkpoint, maybe a yearly one, or more often than that, you know, in the beginning, maybe more often, because there's a probationary period usually. So you want to kind of steer the train right on its track sooner rather than later.
Or maybe we could even tie it back to the challenge question we're solving and say, how can it be done in a more continuous basis so that that information can inform decision making?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I remember even in these, in the ways that they would check in on how we formed our networks, we started to develop people maps. And so we would, if we said we were talking to A, B, and C, then they would actually map out who are the people that are really reaching out and helping the rest of their team members more. And then you could see these maps of, oh my gosh, there's this huge node of this one person who's just really been helping everybody out. And then there's these people that are just siloed, kind of out there alone, not reaching out, not, you know, receptive about reaching out. And so that was a way for us to track, you know, who could be left behind, and who are the ones that are maybe natural affinity to want to help people out.
Awesome.
What if there was a way that the like KPI or like the measures of success for these individuals, like these cognitively diverse individuals in the organization, what if their performance or their measure of success was tied to the, I don't know, the journey that they've been invested in with someone new coming into the company, if that makes sense? I mean, you probably know this better than I do, Stretch. I have no idea like the proper lingo or like the terms being used, but
very good idea. It's a very good idea. And our timekeeper Stretch has, you know, also let us know that it's 8:35. But I'm look how far we've gotten. I mean, we finished this.
Yeah, this is awesome.
Yay!
Yeah. And you know, one of the really great things about this process is it can weave, it can wind, and you can think, well, how is this answering the question we set out to answer? And then look, at the very end of it, we answered the very question we set out to answer, even if we took a bit of a windy road to get there.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. And to quickly wrap this up, and I appreciate everyone who stayed on. I know we're a little bit over time. We're going to go over to what we intend to do with this workflow. And so our next steps, whoops, I went a little too far. Our next steps is that we would love to keep in touch with you, especially through Slack. And so we're going to send a poll at some point, probably not tonight because it is getting late. But we'd love to know who is interested in seeing the results when we prototype this workflow. And so I know a little bit of work has to go into it in terms of how is this going to be feasible? How is this going to be visually represented in terms of creating an actual prototype? And we do intend to test this. We're going to see what it's like and what it looks like out in the wild. And we'd love to know who's interested in learning about the results and seeing how they can contribute to keep refining it and implement that in their own organizations. So I wanted to thank everyone so much for their time. I know it's been a it's been a jam-packed 2.5 hours, but we are so appreciative for all the work that everyone has done throughout this past week, to the team, and also just jumping on during the introductory meeting, and also our ideation session tonight. And so thank you so much to our speakers as well. Huge thank you to you. And Will, did you want to add on to any parting words?
Just to wrap it up, you know, we will be noting in the Slack channel that tomorrow we'll have a bit of a conversation to wrap up, to do a little bit of a postmortem, and to get any ideas or thoughts that you might otherwise have. And we're going to continue speaking in the Slack channel. When we create our prototypes, we're going to share them there, and we're going to keep engaged, because this is look how far we've come in actually solving this. And so if we can actually create this solution together, you know, what could we accomplish? So thank you all for joining. Thanks again to the folks at Forbes. And we look forward to keeping in touch with you all.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Take care, everyone.
Good night.